Hey everyone. This week we get to have the fun of digging into the story of the crucifixion. Obviously, not the most fun topic, but one that is rather important for our faith. The culmination of Jesus' ministry in so many ways. So we'll look at Matthew in 27, chapter 27. But before I start really digging into the Bible itself, I wanted to share a quick story that I ran into this week that I think is a fairly good metaphor to keep in the back of our mind as we are looking at the crucifixion. So, this author that I was reading said he had a friend who was an explorer and a caver. And he had discovered that this cave system that was miles underground, that as far as everyone knew, there wasn't a way out of this expansive cave system. But he and his team thought that there might be a way out of this cave system if they went through this underwater lake. They thought there might be a way out, which is obviously pretty dangerous. And so he and his team were going to go down there and explore this. But when they got to the moment when they were actually going to go down into this deep, dark lake and look for a way out, they recognized just how dangerous this could be. That they may or may not be coming back, and this explorer had something of a rebellion on his hands. People said this is dumb, this is dangerous. There's no reason we should, risk our lives to discover this new way out. And this caver, this explorer, realized people were not going to go down there with him. He had to go explore it himself, and if there was a way through, he was going to have to figure it out himself and then come back and show them the way through this subterranean lake. I suspect you can see where I'm going with this metaphor. But keep that in the back of your mind as we start kind of looking at and digging into the significance of Jesus' crucifixion. So I'm going to start in Matthew chapter 27. I'm going to start verse 27. The governor's soldiers took Jesus into the governor's house, and they gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a red military coat on him. They twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They put a stick in his right hand. They bowed down in front of him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spit on him. They took the stick and struck his head again and again. And when they'd finished mocking him, they stripped him of the military coat, put on his own clothes, and they led him away to crucify him. So, an important aspect of the way Matthew tells about the crucifixion, an important aspect of what is going on overall in this story, is the Romans. They represent, I think they show what political power and what violence does to people. They show God's way in contrast to one of the many ways of the world. And something that is really important to this story about how the crucifixion works that we don't often pay enough attention to is the fact that Jesus is exposing himself, what appears unnecessarily if you consider the glory and power he has available to him. Right? We hear the story of Peter pulling out his sword to defend him, and Jesus says, "Look, I've got all the power I need. I've got the angels," and he is allowing this to happen to him. And I think one of the important things that this story is doing, what the crucifixion itself does, is Jesus is opening himself to all the power of violence, of worldly political power. In this story, we're also going to see opening himself to all the strength and opposition of the dark spiritual powers, the devil, and all those that follow him. We are going to see him exposing himself to the power of sin, with everything that is spiritually wrong that comes from sin. We're going to see him exposing himself to all the power of death itself, this thing that is foreign and false to the way God made the world, even though we are so used to it. And all these powers of darkness, whether it's political violence, political power, all the way through the spiritual and death and sin itself, they get their best shot at Jesus, the author of life. Jesus in the crucifixion is giving them full reign. He's allowing them to do their absolute worst to him to see and show what their power is. And I think this is a really important part of the crucifixion because it shows what an utter sham those things that we think of as so powerful, as so overwhelming are. They can't even keep Jesus in the ground more than a couple of days. And a lot of people believe that during those days, he's down in hell itself, preaching the good news to people, inviting them out of hell. Sin, power, violence, death, these things that are so overwhelming and that our world worships in so many different ways because they work, right? We're used to seeing rage and anger get places in life. We're used to seeing those that are the strongest and the most powerful get their way. We've seen this in history. We've seen this in the political arena. We've seen this in petty workplaces. And all of those things, all this power of violence, all this power of darkness, Jesus is exposing, saying that they are ultimately shams. You cannot give your life to these things. They will not ultimately be enough to stand up against God and his ways, the just exuberant life that comes through his love, this exuberant life he is offering if we trust him and trust in his nonviolence and we trust in his way of being in the world and in the community rather than the things that seem to work from a worldly perspective. And so the crucifixion, this disgusting display and mocking of Jesus we're going to see throughout the crucifixion has a really important role, that Jesus allows these things to happen to him because he is showing what a sham power those things are. And I think it's a lesson that we as the church need to be reminded of sometimes, because even today we are still very tempted to follow the ways of power, to follow the ways of anger in the world, to follow the ways that seem to work rather than trusting in God's ways of doing things. So that's one of the big themes showing up, especially in that section with the soldiers, but I think it's in this entire story. So I'm going to move on. And as they were going out, they found Simon, a man from Cyrene. They forced him to carry his cross, and when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means the skull place, they gave Jesus wine mixed with vinegar to drink. But after tasting it, he didn't want to drink it. After they crucified him, they divided up his clothes among them by drawing lots. They sat there guarding him. They placed above his head the charge against him, and it read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." They crucified him with two outlaws, one on his right and one on his left. Those who were walking by insulted Jesus, shaking their heads, saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Were you? Save yourself. If you are God's son, come down from that cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the legal experts and elders, were making fun of him, saying, "He saved others, can't save himself. If he's the king of Israel, let him come down from the cross now. Then we'll believe in him. He trusts God, so let God deliver him now if he wants to. He said, 'I'm God's son.'" The outlaws as well that were crucified with him insulted him in the exact same way. And so I think the common insult, the common thing that all these different groups are saying to Jesus echoes kind of the temptation in some ways. You claimed to be God's beloved. You claimed that you were his son. You claimed you understood the way he works and the ways of the world. And I think they're all kind of mocking him, saying the cross and the violence being done to you right now proves your way was wrong, that God does not have your back, that you are inept, that you are weak. And I think that, as I said earlier on the violence, I think that's exactly the opposite of what the cross is showing. The cross is not proving God's weakness, but his strength to drink these things to the fullness, to allow them to, break like a wave across his shore. The crucifixion looks an awful lot like defeat. And yet, as we're going to see as we keep going, this in fact shows Jesus' victory and his true humanity if we know how to look at it. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, the whole earth was dark. At about 3, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you left me?" After hearing him, some standing there said, "He's calling Elijah." One of them ran over, took a sponge full of vinegar, and put it on a pole. He offered it to Jesus to drink. But the rest of them said, "Let's see if Elijah will come and save him." Again, Jesus cried with a loud voice, and then he died. So one, I think, important thing that Matthew's highlighting here is that Jesus is drinking the human experience to the full. We were already told that he turned away the chance to have his feelings numbed. We are told that he is experiencing something we've all experienced, and that is distance from God. Sin as it came upon him, the just griminess of sin and spiritual depravity, Jesus is experiencing. He's experiencing something that we all know in one way or another. It's something that we're so used to, we forget how horrific and how foreign to our true being sin and death and ugliness are. He's also showing us what faith looks like. He has experienced his entire life up until this point God's utter presence and utter delight, the thing that he desires for us. He's never been without it. And that's the opportunity for faith, right? We say we trust God even when every ounce of our fiber says this is wrong, that God can't be there, that God can't make something good out of it. And Jesus is experiencing that in the midst of sin, in the midst of that separation. He still trusts that God knows what he's doing, that God is going to bring something good and beautiful out of this. And as I was saying, where everyone else is kind of mocking Jesus, saying, this proves you're a loser. This proves that what you said isn't true. I think the references to Elijah are giving us a hint that this is in fact the culmination of what Jesus has been up to his entire career. All the healings, all the teachings have always been headed to the cross. In the Gospel of Matthew, Elijah shows up a couple other times. One in talking about John the Baptist. John the Baptist is compared to Elijah, and his job is largely to point Jesus on the road, to start his ministry, to let people know that there is a new way out of sin. But he tells Jesus right from the beginning, it's not going to be an easy path, right? He points him on a very difficult path, as he kind of testified with his own life in the way he lived in the desert and in the way he died. We see Elijah show one other point in this gospel, and that's at the transfiguration. It's the spiritual side. And it says that Elijah and Moses were there encouraging Jesus. And right after that is when he starts teaching for the cross. And so while every one of Jesus' contemporaries, and I think many of us nowadays, still tend to think of the cross as evidence of something going wrong. I heard it compared to this glittering career that met kind of a tragic ending. Elijah reminds us, just like Jesus has this whole time, this is where he was headed the whole time. All the miracles, all the teaching were headed towards this. In Matthew, it says, as Jesus died, he let out a loud cry. We're told in the other Gospels that it is the cry, "It is finished." And this is the cry of a victor, of someone who has completed a difficult task. And so even as death claims him, Jesus is more or less shouting out, "I win!" And that can be hard to see because it sure doesn't look like he wins, right? It looks like Jesus has lost everything. He's been proven utterly wrong in who he said God was and who he said he was. And then yet, this ultimate defeat is where ultimate victory comes from. It exposes the power of sin and death. God outlasts those things. He shows his life and his love are more powerful. It is what he uses to kill the power of sin and death. And even though it's going to take, I'd say the rest of human history for us to figure out the true significance of what happened on the cross, we get some little hints right away in this story. The universal significance of this crucifixion shows up almost immediately in little foretastes in these next few verses. We're told, "Look, the curtain of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised. After Jesus' resurrection, they came out of their graves and went into the holy city, where they appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and what had happened, they were filled with awe and said, "Certainly, this was God's Son." We get the significance of Jesus' life and who he was echoed immediately. The physical world is a part of that. The physical world recognizes something has happened. We've got this earthquake. We've got this change in the sky. I heard this compared to a little mini apocalypse, right? It's a hint of the way the world will end. The world at some point will die so that it can be made new. And it gives kind of a foretaste of that here. The physical world recognizes that the crucifixion is Jesus redeeming creation, the world, beloved materiality, as God sees it. There's a spiritual significance as well, and I think that's obviously the tearing down of this curtain that was in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. It was keeping people out of God's presence. It was protecting God and his holiness and his uniqueness from the power of sin. And the first thing that happens spiritually when the sin and power of Jesus is shown is God tears that thing in half. God shows that his holiness is for everyone, that everyone can wander into his presence, that everyone has access who wants it now. I think we see a foretaste of the exposure of sin and death's just ineptitude here as well. I think that's what this weird story of people coming back to life is. Death, this foreign invader to God's creation, has been forced to release some of his captives, like he will be forced to do eventually in the resurrection at the end of the world. Everyone will be freed. And so we see some fruit as well in this acknowledgement, right? People get it. The moment the crucifixion has, people see and realize who Jesus is. This was God's Son. And who is it on the lips of? Not one of the disciples, not one of the priests or the people who are supposed to get it. It's an outsider, a heathen. This was God's Son. The cross meant something, and I suspect it changed this man's life. And we're going to see that pattern as well in all of church history and everything significant. God connecting with those who are outside, God connecting with and being understood by those who aren't supposed to. Why? Because the cross makes Jesus' life and resurrection available to anyone. And so as we look at this theme of resurrection again, I think there's a few important responses that we should be thinking about right now. One is outrage and horror. One, this kind of brutality, this kind of injustice is still happening in the world. Jesus joined humanity in some of its worst experiences. We should be angry and we should be outraged. We should be angry and we should be outraged that Jesus' love and God's love of the world came in this response. We should be outraged that we find this response in our own lives at times, that God's love is responded to with a cross. We want nothing to do with his way, with his ways of loving. But I think on the positive side, we should be awed. We should be overwhelmed that God can use something as awful as this situation, as awful as this crucifixion, as awful as this response to his beautiful love, to bring about wholeness and restoration. We should be awed by recognizing he did this for you. He did this for me. Not in the abstract, but because we could not be free without his help, without his intervention, without him taking that pain and that sorrow and that rage of death and violence and everything else on himself. We could not be free. And that is why he did it. And so I just think we are signing up in many ways for a lifetime of pondering the significance of this cross, of trying to live it out, of trying to share this central truth that we are free and that we are changed. We have a lifetime and we have the rest of eternity to try and figure out what this actually means for our lives. And that is why I think when Jesus talks about this, before it even happened, he says, take up your own cross, follow me. Which I think gets us back to that point we started at, of that diver. Because I think something a lot more terrifying than an underground cave stands before us. Jesus has plumbed the depths of death itself. And he is saying, I've returned. I know the way through. I know the way to resurrection. And what we tend to want to do is avoid sin. We want to avoid death. We want to avoid the ugly things in life, saying, God, if you really loved me, I wouldn't have to experience this. That was what they were all mocking Jesus for, right? That was the temptation, saying, take the easy path. Don't go through this to discover life and God's power on the other side. And so I think Jesus is standing at the shore of death saying, I've been through it. Come and follow. Take up your own cross. I know the way through this. Take up your own cross. Don't let life be about your comfort. Don't let life be about your way of doing things. Follow me into death, because on the other side is resurrection and is life. Amen.